Sure. Well, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly passed a resolution calling for member states of NATO to designate Russia as a terrorist state. Now, it's important to note this is a non binding resolution. So any actual fallout from it remains to be seen. It's not clear that this will have any definite results. Now, this comes as the Czech lower house of parliament did recently pass a similar resolution. There has been a similar resolution put forward before the European Parliament. Now, the Russian Foreign Ministry has designated these kinds of statements as xenophobic and essentially spreading hatred for one country. And it's important to note the details of the resolution because, in addition to calling for Russia to be designated as a terrorist state, the language of this resolution that was just passed by the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, it calls for giving more weapons and more support to the government in Kiev, which would essentially lead to prolonging this conflict and more death and more suffering. Here's some of that language.
Welcoming the strengthened comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine and the commitment by NATO to help Ukraine transition to modern equipment, boost interoperability, and bolster further Ukraine's defense and security institutions, and applauding the crucial military, economic, and humanitarian assistance that individual allies and partners are providing Ukraine.
Now, in his remarks before the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, we heard President Zelensky of Ukraine. He went ahead and called for speeding up the applications of Ukraine in order to join the European Union as well as to join the NATO alliance. Now, it's been pointed out in other remarks by the leader of Portugal, the Portuguese prime minister. He said when he spoke that it didn't seem like such a thing was very likely. He referred to the fact that it seems like the European Union and NATO aren't looking for new members anytime soon.
The European Union has very clear criteria for the accession of new member states, but unfortunately, it does not have criteria for its own capacity to receive new member states. The European Union does not have the conditions to meet the expectations it is now creating, and the rebound effect of these expectations will be a huge drama in the short term if they are dashed.
Zelensky called for long-term cooperation between Europe and Ukraine. And when this assembly resolution was being discussed, there were a number of countries that did emphasize that regardless of the situation in Ukraine, geography isn't going to change. And Russia will be their neighbor regardless. And some kind of relationship with a country right on their border will be a necessity.
I mean, declaring Russia a terrorist state essentially places it beyond the pale of civilized discourse. It makes negotiations much harder. It makes things like trade deals to facilitate the shipment of grain from Black Sea ports. It makes that harder as well. It makes all kinds of diplomatic relations more difficult. Using the terrorism label in this way is completely arbitrary and will undermine whatever fight there is against terrorism. It is just monstrously hypocritical. I mean, these European invasions, nations backed the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, which caused untold suffering, led to incredible levels of violence. They backed the arming of jihadi, pro-Al-Qaeda jihadis in Syria, which who tore the country apart and spread terror from one end of the country to the other. And they have also backed the Saudi war on Yemen, which has resulted in the greatest humanitarian disaster in the modern world. So who is calling who a terrorist?